A quiet night turned chaotic. The diner was quiet, the hum of conversation and the clatter of cutlery filling the air with a sense of normalcy. Keisha and Chris Johnson sat in their usual corner booth, the warm light overhead creating a cozy glow. For them, this local diner was more than a place to eat. It was a sanctuary, a reprieve from the hustle of their busy lives. The couple had shared countless memories here, from celebrations to quiet moments of reflection. Tonight, it was supposed to be one of those calm, peaceful evenings. Keisha laughed softly as Chris recounted a story from work, his deep voice soothing. And then she tried to convince me that the copier was haunted. Chris chuckled, shaking his head. "You're making that up," Keisha teased, her eyes shining with amusement. "I swear," Chris replied, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You wouldn't believe the things I see in that office." As their food arrived, Keisha's favorite fried chicken and waffles, and Chris's hearty burger and fries, they dug in, savoring the moment. It had been a long week, and this was their chance to reconnect, to enjoy each other's company without the weight of the world pressing down on them. But the peaceful evening took a sharp turn when two police officers entered the diner. Their voices were loud, their laughter brash, cutting through the diner's serene atmosphere like a jagged knife. The older officer, whose name tag read Mitchell, was tall and wiry, with a sneer that seemed permanently etched on his face. His partner, a heavier man with a scowl to match, followed closely behind. Chris noticed them first, his instincts kicking in. Years in the Marines had trained him to be hyper-aware of his surroundings, to pick up on subtle shifts in energy. The moment the officers walked in, the atmosphere changed. Chris didn't say anything to Keisha, not wanting to alarm her, but he couldn't ignore the tension that now hung in the air. The officers scanned the diner, their eyes lingering a little too long on certain patrons. When their gazes landed on Keisha, something flickered in Mitchell's expression. Something cruel. Chris excused himself to the restroom, his mind already racing with unease. Keisha, oblivious to the officer's stares, focused on her plate, cutting into her waffle and humming softly to herself. But when she glanced up, she found Mitchell standing at the edge of her table, his smirk cold and mocking. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "What do we have here?" Keisha froze, her fork hovering midair. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Mitchell's smirk widened. "I didn't realize this diner was taking all kinds now," he sneered, gesturing vaguely at the room. Keisha's heart pounded, but she refused to let him see her fear. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, meeting his gaze with a calm defiance that only seemed to irritate him further. "Oh, you know exactly what I mean," Mitchell shot back, leaning closer. His partner chuckled darkly from a few steps away, clearly enjoying the scene. The diner grew eerily silent. The other patrons, sensing the brewing confrontation, kept their heads down, their eyes fixed firmly on their plates. No one dared to intervene. "Pick it up," Mitchell barked suddenly, knocking Keisha's purse off the table. Its contents spilled across the floor in a loud clatter, drawing a few startled gasps from nearby diners. Keisha stared at him, her jaw tightening. Slowly, deliberately, she bent down to gather her belongings, her movements steady and controlled. A single tear threatened to spill, but she blinked it back. She would not give him the satisfaction. As she straightened, her husband Chris stepped out of the restroom. His sharp eyes took in the scene in an instant. The mocking smirk on Mitchell's face, the scattered contents of Keisha's purse, the tension in her posture. Chris's demeanor shifted. His usual easygoing nature gave way to a quiet, commanding presence. He crossed the diner in a few long strides, placing himself between Keisha and the officers. "Is there a problem here?" Chris asked, his voice low but firm. Mitchell turned to him, his sneer faltering for a moment before he recovered. "Who the hell are you?" Chris didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, unyielding. "I'm her husband," he replied, "and I'd suggest you take a step back." The room seemed to hold its breath. Mitchell's partner shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Chris and Mitchell. "Look," Mitchell said, his tone still dripping with arrogance. "This isn't your business, buddy. Why don't you sit down and let us handle it?" Chris tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a small, humorless smile. "Oh, I think you've handled enough." The tension crackled like a live wire. Kisha watched in awe as her husband stood his ground, his calm confidence a stark contrast to Mitchell's bravado. Mitchell took a step closer, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "You don't want to do this," he warned, though his voice wavered slightly. Chris didn't move. "I think you'll find I'm more than ready." Before Mitchell could respond, the door to the diner burst open, and the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. A line in the sand. The air outside the diner was crisp, the flashing red and blue lights from the approaching squad cars illuminating the parking lot. Chris stood in front of Kisha, his body a barrier between her and the officers. Mitchell's bravado faltered as he glanced toward the door. His partner shuffled uneasily, his hand twitching near his radio, but not daring to call for backup. The balance of power was shifting, and everyone could feel it. Kisha's breath hitched as the lead officer entered the diner. She was a tall, imposing woman with a sharp gaze and a commanding presence. Her badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and her no-nonsense demeanor filled the room. She scanned the scene quickly, taking in the spilled purse, Kisha's tense posture, and the way Mitchell's hand lingered near his baton. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. Mitchell stiffened. "Just handling a situation," he replied, his tone defensive. "This guy here," he pointed at Chris, decided to interfere. The lead officer raised an eyebrow, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Interfere with what exactly?" Chris stepped forward, his calm voice carrying the weight of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to defend. "Your officers were harassing my wife. They knocked her purse off the table and tried to intimidate her. I stepped in to stop it." The lead officer's gaze shifted to Kisha, who nodded silently, her lips pressed into a firm line. The other patrons, emboldened by the arrival of reinforcements, began to murmur among themselves. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap stood up, clearing his throat. "He's telling the truth," the man said, his voice steady. "I saw the whole thing." These two were out of line. Others began to chime in, their voices overlapping as they recounted what they had witnessed. The lead officer raised a hand to quiet them, her expression growing colder by the second as she turned back to Mitchell. "Is that true?" she asked, her tone dangerously low. Mitchell's face turned red. "They're exaggerating," he spat. "You know how people like them are." The room went silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Kisha's chest tightened, her fingernails digging into her palms. Chris' expression didn't change, but the intensity in his eyes spoke volumes. The lead officer took a step closer to Mitchell, her voice dropping to a low growl. "I don't tolerate the kind of talk on my team. Step outside now." Mitchell opened his mouth to protest, but the officer silenced him with a glare. His partner hesitated for a moment before following him out, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The lead officer turned back to Chris and Kisha, her posture softening slightly. "I'm sorry for what happened tonight," she said. "I'll be taking statements from everyone here, and I'll make sure this is handled." Chris nodded, his stance relaxing just a fraction. "Thank you," he replied, his tone sincere but still guarded. As the officers began taking statements from the patrons, Chris and Kisha sat back down at their table. The waitress approached hesitantly, setting down a fresh cup of coffee and a slice of pie. "On the house," she said with a small smile. "You handled that like a pro." Kisha managed a weak smile in return. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. Chris's hand found hers under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It's over," he said softly, but they both knew it wasn't entirely true. People like Mitchell didn't just let things go. When they finally left the diner, the night felt heavier than when they had arrived. As Chris unlocked the car, Keisha glanced back at the building, her heart still racing. "Do you think this is really the end of it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Chris's jaw tightened. "No," he admitted, "but we'll be ready." The calm before the storm. The house was quiet the next morning, but the stillness felt unnatural, like the hush before a thunderstorm. Keisha stood in the kitchen, her hands methodically washing dishes, but her mind was elsewhere. The events of the previous night replayed in her head like a broken record. The mocking sneers of the officers, the sound of her purse hitting the floor, and the controlled, commanding way Chris had stood up for her. Chris sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him, though his attention wasn't on the screen. His fingers drummed lightly against the edge of the table, his brows furrowed in thought. He had been quiet all morning, his usual easy smile replaced by a hardened focus that Keisha hadn't seen before. "Chris," she asked, breaking the silence. He looked up, his gaze softening as it met hers. "Yeah. Do you think they'll come back?" Her voice wavered, betraying the fear she had been trying to suppress. Chris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't think Mitchell is the type to let things go." Keisha set the dish she was washing down and turned to face him. "What do we do then? We can't just sit here and wait for something to happen." Chris nodded, his jaw tightening. "We won't. I've been thinking about this all night. We need to be proactive, not reactive." Keisha raised an eyebrow. "Proactive how?" Chris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked over to her, taking her hands in his. "Keisha, there's something I need you to understand. Last night wasn't just about what happened at the diner. It was a reminder that there are people in this world who will abuse their power and think they can get away with it. And sometimes, standing up to them means more than just words." Keisha stared at him, her heart pounding. "What are you saying, Chris?" He hesitated, then said, "I'm saying we need to be prepared. I've made some calls, people I trust, people who can help us if things escalate." Keisha frowned. "What kind of help are we talking about?" Chris didn't elaborate, but the look in his eyes told her it was serious. "Trust me," he said quietly. "I won't let anything happen to you. To us." That afternoon, as Keisha tried to go about her day, Chris made a series of calls from his study. His tone was firm, authoritative, the voice of a man who had once led troops into dangerous situations. Keisha couldn't hear the full conversations, but the snippets she caught only heightened her unease. By evening, a black SUV pulled up outside their house. Keisha peered through the curtains, her stomach tightening as a tall man with a military bearing stepped out. He carried a duffel bag and moved with the kind of precision that made it clear he wasn't an ordinary visitor. Chris opened the door before the man could knock, greeting him with a firm handshake and a nod. "Thanks for coming, Tyler." "No problem," Tyler replied, his voice calm but serious. His eyes flicked to Keisha, and he gave her a polite nod. "Ma'am." Keisha managed a weak smile. "Hi." As Tyler stepped inside, he set the duffel bag on the dining table and unzipped it. Keisha's breath caught as she saw the contents: flashlights, radios, and other tactical tools that looked far more suited to a battlefield than a suburban home. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice tinged with alarm. "Precautions," Tyler replied simply. "Chris told me what's been going on. If that cop or anyone else comes around looking for trouble, you'll be ready." Keisha's stomach churned. This is too much. We're not in a war zone." Tyler's expression darkened. "Maybe not, but people like Mitchell don't play by the rules. It's better to be overprepared than caught off guard." Chris nodded, his focus on the items Tyler was laying out. "He's right. This isn't just about us, Keisha. If we don't stand up to him now, he'll keep doing this to other people. And next time, it might be someone who doesn't have the resources or the support to fight back." Keisha looked between the two men, her heart sinking. She hated the idea of living like this, of being constantly on edge, waiting for the next threat. But she knew Chris was right. Mitchell wasn't going to back down, and they couldn't afford to either. That night, Chris and Tyler walked the perimeter of the property, checking the locks on the gates and windows and discussing security measures. Keisha watched from the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She felt a mix of fear and admiration for her husband. Fear for what they might be up against, and admiration for his unwavering resolve. As the clock ticked past midnight, the house was still and quiet once more, but none of them slept easily. Chris stayed awake in the living room, his gaze fixed on the window. Tyler rested on the couch, his body relaxed but his mind alert. And Keisha lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. Just as she began to drift off, a loud bang shattered the silence. Keisha bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Chris," she called out, her voice trembling. Chris was already on his feet, flashlight in hand, motioning for her to stay in the bedroom. Tyler was close behind him, his movements swift and deliberate. "Stay here," Chris told her firmly. "We'll handle it." Keisha nodded, her hands shaking as she clutched her phone. As Chris and Tyler disappeared into the hallway, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The first strike. The bang echoed through the still night air, reverberating through the house like a thunderclap. Chris moved swiftly, flashlight in one hand and a radio in the other, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. Tyler followed closely, his every movement deliberate and precise. Years of military experience between the two men made their actions instinctual, controlled, calm, and ready for anything. Keisha stood frozen in the doorway of the bedroom, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the silence that followed the noise. Her fingers gripped her phone, her mind racing. Should she call the police? Or would that only escalate things? Chris reached the front door first, carefully peeking through the curtain. He could see the faint glow of a flashlight beam flickering outside near the driveway, cutting through the darkness like a predator's eyes. He motioned for Tyler, who gave a single nod and moved to the side window to get a better angle. Tyler's voice was low but firm. "There's someone near the cars. Looks like they're messing with the tires." Chris's jaw tightened. "How many?" "Just one," Tyler replied. "But they're keeping low. Could be more nearby." Chris's mind raced. Whoever this was, they weren't trying to break into the house. They wanted to send a message. A warning. But the timing couldn't have been a coincidence, not after Mitchell's threats. "Stay inside, Keisha," Chris called back, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm not leaving you out there alone," she protested, stepping closer. Chris turned, his expression firm but softened by concern. "Please, just stay here. I need to know you're safe." Reluctantly, Keisha nodded, stepping back into the shadows of the hallway. Chris and Tyler exchanged a glance, and with a silent agreement, they moved toward the back door. Tyler unlocked it with a practiced ease, the faint creak of the hinges the only sound breaking the silence. They slipped outside, the cool night air brushing against their skin as they crouched low and crept toward the source of the noise. The figure near the cars didn't notice them at first, too focused on slashing the tires with a glinting blade. Chris signaled to Tyler, who moved to flank the intruder from the opposite side. The coordination was seamless, like a dance rehearsed 1,000 times. Chris stepped forward first, his flashlight cutting through the darkness and landing squarely on the man's face. The intruder flinched, dropping the knife and shielding his eyes. "Step away from the car," Chris ordered, his voice calm but commanding. The man hesitated, his gaze darting between Chris and Tyler, who had emerged from the shadows with his own flashlight trained on him. "You don't know who you're messing with," the man spat, his voice shaky but defiant. "Neither do you," Tyler countered, his tone icy. The intruder's confidence wavered, but he tried to recover, squaring his shoulders. "Mitchell won't let this go," he sneered. "You should have just stayed quiet." Chris's eyes narrowed. "Tell Mitchell he picked the wrong family to mess with." Before the man could respond, The faint sound of sirens began to build in the distance. His eyes widened, and he bolted, disappearing into the darkness before Chris or Tyler could stop him. "Let him go," Chris said, his voice steady. "He's scared now. That'll make him sloppy." The two men returned to the house, where Kisha was waiting anxiously by the door. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Chris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "One guy trying to intimidate us. He ran when he heard the cops." Kisha's face paled. "What if he comes back? What if he brings more people next time?" Chris exchanged a glance with Tyler before answering. "We'll be ready," he said firmly. "But for now, we need to stay calm and focused." The police arrived moments later, their presence bringing a brief sense of relief. Chris and Tyler explained what had happened, providing a description of the intruder and handing over the knife he had dropped. The officers took notes, promising to patrol the area more frequently, but their reassurances felt hollow. As the squad cars pulled away, Kisha turned to Chris, her eyes filled with fear. "This isn't going to stop, is it?" Chris pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "It will," he promised, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. "We just have to stay strong." The next morning, Tyler sat at the dining table, methodically cleaning and organizing the tools he had brought. Kisha watched from the kitchen, her unease growing with every passing moment. "Do you think that guy will tell Mitchell what happened?" she asked. Tyler glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Probably, but that's not a bad thing. Letting him know you're not afraid will make him think twice before trying something again." Chris entered the room, his phone in hand. "I called Detective Daniels," he said. "She's sending someone over to install a camera system around the house. It'll give us more eyes on the property." Kisha nodded, though the idea of being constantly surveilled only added to her discomfort. "This isn't how we're supposed to live," she said quietly. Chris walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I know," he said, "but it's temporary. Once we deal with Mitchell, things will go back to normal." Kisha wasn't sure she believed him, but she didn't have the energy to argue. Instead, she focused on cleaning up the remnants of breakfast, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house settled into an uneasy quiet. Chris and Tyler took turns patrolling the property, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Kisha stayed inside, her nerves frayed but her resolve unwavering. But as midnight approached, a loud, deliberate knock echoed through the house. Chris and Tyler exchanged a glance, their bodies tensing. Chris motioned for Kisha to stay back as he moved toward the door, his flashlight in hand. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with a man he hadn't seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a scar running down the side of his face. His eyes were cold, calculating. "Mr. Johnson," the man said, his voice smooth and chilling. "I think it's time we had a talk. Shadows and secrets." Chris's grip on the flashlight tightened as he faced the stranger on his porch. The man stood tall, exuding a quiet menace. His scarred face was a map of conflict, his piercing eyes cold and calculating. Chris could tell immediately that this wasn't a random visit. This man was here on Mitchell's behalf. Kisha peeked around the corner, her breath catching as she saw the stranger. She didn't recognize him, but the air around him felt heavy, oppressive. Tyler appeared silently behind Chris, his expression unreadable, but his body language tense. "Who are you?" Chris asked, his voice calm but firm. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My name doesn't matter. I'm here to deliver a message." Chris raised an eyebrow, his stance unyielding. "I'm listening." The stranger's smile faded, replaced by a hard, cold stare. "Mitchell doesn't take kindly to people standing in his way. He's got friends, people who can make your life very difficult if you don't cooperate." Chris didn't flinch. "Let me guess. You're one of those friends." The man chuckled darkly. "You could say that, but I prefer to think of myself as someone who solves problems. And right now, You're a problem. Tyler stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. If you're here to intimidate us, you're wasting your time. The man's gaze shifted to Tyler, his expression unimpressed. You military types always think you're untouchable. But this isn't a battlefield. This is the real world. And in the real world, people like me call the shots. Chris crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. If you've got something to say it. Otherwise, you're trespassing. The man smirked, taking a step closer. Here's the deal. Drop the statements. Tell your wife to stay quiet. Forget about Mitchell, and move on with your lives. Do that, and this ends here. And if we don't? Chris asked, his voice steady. The man's smile disappeared entirely. Then we make your life a living hell. Accidents happen all the time, Mr. Johnson. Cars skid off the road. Houses catch fire. People disappear. Kisha gasped softly from her hiding spot, her hands trembling. Chris didn't so much as blink. You're making threats on my property, he said, his tone cold. That's mistake number one. The man's jaw tightened. You think you're untouchable because you've got a clean record and a badge in your corner. But trust me, I've seen men like you fall. You don't know who you're dealing with. Chris stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Neither do you. The tension crackled between them like a live wire. Tyler, standing just behind Chris, shifted his weight slightly, his posture ready for action. The man took a step back, his smirk returning. I'll let Mitchell know you're not interested in cooperating. Don't say I didn't warn you. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back toward a black sedan parked down the street. Chris and Tyler watched him go, their eyes never leaving his retreating figure. Once the car disappeared into the night, Chris closed the door and turned to Keisha, who was standing in the hallway, her face pale. Who was that? She asked, her voice trembling. Trouble, Chris replied grimly. Keisha crossed her arms tightly, her fear bubbling to the surface. Chris, this is getting out of hand. They're not just trying to scare us. They're threatening our lives. Chris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I know. That's why we're not backing down. The next move. The following morning, Chris, Keisha, and Tyler sat around the dining table, the duffel bag of tools spread out in front of them. The air was thick with tension as they strategized their next steps. We need to take this to Daniels, Tyler said, his voice steady. That guy wasn't just a thug. He's part of something bigger. Chris nodded. Agreed. But we also need to prepare for the possibility that Daniels can't act fast enough. These people aren't playing by the rules. Keisha rubbed her temples, her exhaustion evident. How are we supposed to fight this? They have resources, connections. We're just. She trailed off, shaking her head. Chris reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. We're not just anything, Keisha. We've got something they don't, a reason to fight. And I promise you, I'm not going to let them win. Tyler leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the room. First things first, we need to secure this place. Cameras, motion sensors, the works. We can't let them catch us off guard again. Chris stood. I'll call Daniels and let her know about last night. She needs to hear this. A new threat. Later that evening, as Chris and Tyler installed cameras around the property, Keisha sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. A notification from her email caught her eye. A message with no subject line, sent from an unfamiliar address. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. Finally, she opened it. The message was short but chilling. Drop the statements, or you'll regret it. Last warning. Keisha's hand shook as she stared at the words. She called out to Chris, her voice unsteady. Chris and Tyler rushed inside, their expressions hardening when Keisha showed them the email. Chris clenched his jaw. They're escalating. Tyler's eyes narrowed. We need to find out who's sending these messages. This isn't just Mitchell acting alone anymore. Chris nodded, his mind already racing. I'll forward this to Daniels. If we can trace it, maybe we can get a lead on who we're dealing with. Kisha's voice was small, but determined. Chris, I'm scared, but I won't let them silence us. Not after what they've done. Chris pulled her into a tight embrace. We're in this together, Kisha, and we're going to see it through. Turning the tide. Chris leaned over Kisha's shoulder, his eyes scanning the threatening email on her phone. His jaw tightened, and a familiar intensity settled over his features. Tyler paced behind them, his footsteps measured, like a predator circling prey. We need to escalate this to Daniels immediately, Chris said, his voice calm but firm. This is digital evidence, and it shows they're not just bluffing anymore. Kisha nodded, swallowing hard. I'll forward it to her now. Her fingers trembled as she tapped at her phone, attaching the email to a message addressed to Detective Daniels. As she hit send, Chris stood, grabbing his own phone. I'll call her. We can't afford to let this sit in her inbox. Tyler crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. They're testing us, Chris, pushing to see how far they can go before we fold. But that also means they're getting desperate. Chris nodded as he waited for Daniels to pick up. Desperate people make mistakes. We just need to be ready when they do. The officer's response. Detective Daniels answered on the third ring, her voice brisk but attentive. Chris, what's going on? Chris explained the situation, detailing the visit from the scared man and the email. Daniels listened in silence, the occasional sound of a pen scratching against paper on her end. That's a serious escalation, she said finally. I'll get our cyber unit on the email trace, and I'll run this guy's description through our system. But Chris, you need to know something. What's that? Chris asked, his tone even. Mitchell's suspension hasn't deterred him, Daniels said grimly. We've received reports that he's been meeting with known troublemakers, people who operate outside the law. If this scared man is part of his network, it means he's mobilizing resources to come after you. Chris's grip on the phone tightened. So what are you doing about it? We're building a case, Daniels said, her voice firm. But these things take time, and I'm not going to lie to you. Mitchell knows how to cover his tracks. That's why I need you to keep gathering evidence. The more we have, the harder it'll be for him to weasel out of this. Chris sighed, running a hand through his hair. Time isn't something we have in abundance, Daniels. I understand that, she replied. I'll send a patrol car to monitor your street, and I'll push to expedite the case. But Chris, you need to stay vigilant. Don't underestimate him or the people he's working with. Chris thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. Tyler watched him closely. What did she say? She's working on it, Chris replied, his tone edged with frustration. But we're still on our own for now. Setting the trap. By the next morning, the house was more fortified than ever. Cameras dotted the perimeter, motion sensors lined the driveway, and Tyler had even rigged a few rudimentary alarms, tripwires that would send an alert to their phones if someone tried to approach the house unnoticed. Chris and Tyler sat in the kitchen, reviewing the security footage from the previous night. The footage showed the scared man walking away from the property, his gait casual, as if he had nothing to fear. He's confident, Tyler muttered. That means he doesn't think we're a threat. We need to change that. Chris nodded, his jaw tight. If he, or anyone else, comes back, we'll be ready. Just as they finished their review, Kisha walked into the room, holding her phone. I got another email, she said, her voice tense. Chris and Tyler crowded around as she opened it. The message was short but chilling. Tick-tock, Johnson's. Time's running out. Chris's eyes darkened. They're getting bold. Tyler crossed his arms. We need to make a statement. Show them we're not backing down. Chris glanced at him. What are you thinking? A controlled response, Tyler said. We don't go on the offensive, but we let them know we're not easy targets. Set a trap, catch them in the act, and feed Daniels everything she needs to bury them. Chris considered the idea, his mind already working through the logistics. If we do this, we have to be careful. If they realize it's a setup, it could backfire. Tyler smirked. We've been in worse situations, my friend. Trust me, this will work. The bait. That evening, Chris and Tyler set their plan into motion. They left the front gate slightly ajar, a subtle invitation for anyone watching the house. Chris parked his car further down the street, leaving the driveway empty. Inside, Keisha monitored the security cameras from the living room, while Chris and Tyler prepared for a long night. Tyler positioned himself near the back door, a flashlight, and a two-way radio within reach. Chris took the front, his sharp eyes fixed on the monitors. Hours passed in tense silence, the weight of anticipation pressing down on them. Keisha sat on the couch, her nerves fraying with each passing minute. And then, just after midnight, a movement on one of the cameras caught their attention. A figure crept through the shadows, moving toward the house with deliberate caution. "They're here," Chris said, his voice low. Keisha's breath hitched as she watched the screen. "What do we do?" Chris glanced at Tyler. "We stick to the plan." Tyler nodded, his expression grim. "Let's show them what happens when they pick the wrong fight." The reckoning. The faint glow of the security monitors illuminated Chris's face as he watched the shadowy figure inch closer to the house. Keisha sat frozen on the couch, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might drown out the faint rustle of movement outside. Tyler, crouched near the back door, adjusted his position, his body tense and ready. The plan was simple but effective. Let them think they had the upper hand, let them believe their intimidation was working, and then catch them in the act. Every camera, every motion sensor, every strategic tripwire had been placed with precision. If this intruder so much as sneezed, Chris and Tyler would know. On the monitor, the figure reached the gate, nudging it open with a gloved hand. The slight creak of the hinges was audible even inside the house. "He's taking the bait," Tyler whispered over the radio, his voice calm and steady. Chris nodded, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Let him come closer." The figure moved with calculated slowness, stepping lightly to avoid making noise. But every step he took was recorded. Every move captured by the cameras and logged for Detective Daniels. He paused near the driveway, glancing around as if checking for witnesses. Then he made his way to the front door. Confrontation. Chris and Tyler had anticipated this. The cameras outside the front door offered a perfect view of the intruder, his features partially obscured by a hoodie pulled low over his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tool, a slim piece of metal clearly meant for lock-picking. Chris tightened his grip on the flashlight in his hand. "It's showtime," he murmured. Before the intruder could insert the tool into the lock, Chris yanked open the door. The man stumbled back in surprise, his hand darting toward his pocket, likely for a weapon. "Don't," Chris said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The flashlight's beam blinded the man momentarily, and he raised his hands defensively. "You think you're smart," the intruder snarled, his voice low and gravelly. "You think you can scare me." Chris stepped onto the porch, his towering frame radiating calm authority. "No," he replied, his voice steady. "But I can make sure you don't walk away from this without consequences." Before the man could respond, Tyler emerged from the shadows near the side of the house, his flashlight aimed squarely at the intruder's chest. "2 against 1, Tyler said with a smirk. "Bad odds for you." The man hesitated, his hands twitching as if weighing his options. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he growled. Chris's eyes narrowed. "Neither do you. Walk away now, and maybe you'll keep the rest of your night intact. Stay, and you'll leave in cuffs, or worse." The man took a step back, his bravado cracking under the weight of Chris and Tyler's unflinching stares. But just as it seemed he might retreat, the distant hum of an engine grew louder. Chris glanced toward the street, his jaw tightening as a black SUV pulled up, its headlights off. "Back up," Tyler muttered, his posture shifting into a defensive stance. The SUV came to a stop, and 2 more men stepped out, their silhouettes imposing in the faint moonlight. One of them was unmistakably the scared man who had visited Chris the night before. "Well, this is cozy," the scared man said, his tone mocking as he approached the house. "Looks like we got ourselves a little standoff." Chris squared his shoulders, his gaze locked on the man. "If you're here to make threats, you're wasting your time." The scared man chuckled. "Not threats, Mr. Johnson. Promises. Mitchell's not happy with you, and neither am I. You should have kept your mouth shut at that diner." Keisha, watching from the living room, clutched the edge of the couch, her knuckles white. She wanted to call out to Chris, to beg him to come back inside, but something in his posture stopped her. He was in control, completely, utterly in control. "You think showing up with a couple of thugs is going to scare me?" Chris asked, his voice laced with disdain. "You're underestimating the wrong man." The trap closes. Tyler moved subtly to position himself between the intruder on the porch and the two men approaching from the street. He glanced at Chris, giving him a barely perceptible nod. Chris spoke again, his tone deliberate. "You know, this little stunt of yours is being recorded. Cameras everywhere. Audio too. So whatever you thought you were going to accomplish tonight, it's not happening." The scared man's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered. "You're bluffing." Chris gestured toward one of the security cameras mounted above the porch. "Am I?" The scared man glanced at the camera, his jaw tightening. One of his accomplices muttered something under his breath, clearly unnerved. "I suggest you leave," Chris continued, his voice steady. "Before Daniels gets here and adds breaking and entering to the list of charges Mitchell's already facing." The mention of Detective Daniels seemed to strike a nerve. The scared man's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "You think you've won this, don't you?" he said, his voice low. Chris took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. "I think you've already lost." The faint sound of sirens in the distance punctuated his words. The scared man's head snapped toward the street, his expression shifting from confidence to panic. "Time's up," Tyler said, his voice carrying the hint of satisfaction. The scared man cursed under his breath, signaling to his accomplices, "We're done here. For now." As the men retreated to the SUV, the intruder on the porch made a last-ditch effort to lunge toward Chris, but Tyler intercepted him with a swift, practiced move, pinning him against the wall. "You're not going anywhere," Tyler growled. Moments later, the patrol car Daniels had promised roared into the driveway, its lights flashing. Officers poured out, guns drawn, and quickly took control of the scene. The scared man and his accomplices were detained, their threats reduced to desperate protests. Aftermath. Inside the house, Keisha collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. Chris sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. "It's over," he said softly, though the weight in his voice hinted at lingering uncertainty. Tyler leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "For now. But people like them don't go down easy." Detective Daniels arrived shortly after, her expression a mix of relief and frustration. "You handled this well," she admitted, glancing at the footage Chris handed over. "This gives us everything we need to tighten the noose around Mitchell and his crew." Chris nodded, his exhaustion finally starting to show. "Let's hope it sticks." As the police took the intruders away and the chaos finally began to fade, Keisha looked at Chris, her voice trembling. "Do you think it's really over?" Chris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've done everything we can. Now, it's their turn to finish the job." But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one he was prepared to fight for as long as it took to protect the woman he loved. Justice and resolve. The house was quiet again, the chaos of the night replaced by an eerie calm. Chris and Keisha sat on the couch, their hands intertwined. The faint hum of the police radios outside offered some reassurance, but neither of them could fully relax. Tyler remained by the front window, his sharp gaze scanning the street for any lingering threats. Detective Daniels returned after overseeing the arrests. She walked in with a clipboard and a purposeful expression, though her face softened slightly when she saw Keisha's weary posture. "You did well," Daniels said, addressing both Chris and Tyler. "This evidence is solid. The footage from your cameras, the audio, and the fact that they were caught in the act. It's more than enough to charge them. Mitchell's network is unraveling." Chris leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What's next?" Daniels pulled out a chair and sat across from them. "Mitchell will face an internal review on top of the criminal charges. His associates will be interrogated, and with any luck, they'll turn on him. He's losing his grip, and he knows it." "And if they don't turn?" Tyler asked, his arms crossed. Daniels met his gaze evenly. "Then we make sure they don't have a choice. We've got leverage now, thanks to you. This is going to court, and with your testimony, it's unlikely Mitchell will see the light of day for a long time." Keisha exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "So it's really over?" Daniels hesitated. "For the most part, yes. But I'd be lying if I said people like Mitchell don't have a way of leaving ripples even after they're gone. You'll need to stay vigilant, but I'll make sure you're protected." Chris nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll handle it." Daniels stood, giving them a small smile. "You've already handled more than most people could. You've done your part. Now let us do ours. Healing begins." The next morning, the house felt different, lighter, somehow. The weight of the previous night lingered, but the knowledge that Mitchell and his crew were in custody brought a sense of relief. Keisha made breakfast, her movements slow but steady, while Chris reviewed the security footage one last time to ensure everything had been handed over to Daniels. Tyler, ever the soldier, prepared to leave. "You've got this now," he said, clapping Chris on the shoulder. "But you know where to find me if you need anything." Chris gripped Tyler's hand firmly. "I don't know how to thank you." Tyler smirked. "You'd do the same for me." As Tyler left, Keisha joined Chris at the table. She placed a plate of food in front of him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "He's a good friend." Chris nodded, taking her hand. "He is, but you're the one who kept me grounded through all of this." Keisha smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "I don't know if I was strong enough." "You were," Chris said firmly. "You are. And now, we can start putting this behind us." Justice served. Over the following weeks, the pieces fell into place. Mitchell's suspension turned into a formal termination, and the evidence against him led to his arrest on multiple charges, including harassment, conspiracy, and intimidation. His associates, faced with overwhelming evidence, began to cooperate with authorities, unraveling the corrupt network Mitchell had built. Chris and Keisha testified in court, their statements clear and unwavering. The courage they displayed inspired others to come forward, people who had been silenced by fear, but now felt empowered to share their experiences. Mitchell's downfall became a symbol of accountability, a reminder that power could not shield someone from justice forever. Moving forward, months later, Chris and Keisha sat on their back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The house, once a fortress of fear, had become a home again. The cameras remained in place, a precaution they both agreed on, but the constant tension had eased. Keisha leaned her head on Chris's shoulder, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "Do you think we'll ever feel completely normal again?" Chris wrapped an arm around her, his gaze fixed on the fading light. "I think normal might look different now, but we're stronger for it. Together, we can handle anything." She smiled, her fingers intertwining with his. "I believe that." As the stars began to appear, a sense of peace settled over them. They had faced the storm and come out the other side, scared but unbroken. Mitchell's shadow no longer loomed over their lives, and the future, though uncertain, felt full of promise. For Chris and Keisha, the fight had been about more than survival. It was about reclaiming their dignity, standing up against injustice, and proving that love and resilience could overcome even the darkest of threats. And as they sat together under the vast night sky, they knew one thing for certain. They were ready for whatever came next, as long as they had each other.